Now, cost of living, it's our major focus each and every night. Why? Because poll after poll, day after day, people after people tell us it is the number one issue in the country, which is why I'm so relentless in talking about it. 74% of people say that it is their main issue. So now the Prime Minister's out there all day, every day, saying cost of living, 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 but he's doing just about as much this year as he did last year, which was 4/5 of bugger all for the extreme majority of Australians, who are the ones that are actually having the problems. But you know how right we are on this issue? Even The Guardian agrees. One of their award-winning columnists, wrote today that if Albanese wants to keep voters on sides, he actually needs to deliver on cost of living. So finally, unity between the Turnbull Times and Turnbull's favourite primetime TV show. Which again is why the Prime Minister is trying to say one thing over and over again, hoping that if he says it enough, you will believe that finally he cares about what you have cared about even before he became Prime Minister.
We're into making a difference each and every day, and that's what my government's focused on. And you'll see in the lead up to the budget, us continuing to make announcements like we are today that make a practical difference.
Now, this is a slight change in tone from where they were, of course, for most of last year, going into the mid-year economic review, including when the Prime Minister used to constantly tell people that it was more important that the federal government had a surplus than using the surplus of money that they have to do anything about helping people with cost of living. But what's different about this year compared to last year? Oh, that's right. There is a spot in the Parliament up for grabs, largely built in and around this issue. The seat of Dunley, in and around the area of Frankston in Victoria, is of course going to have a by-election. It will have so in late February or into early March. And as I said last night, and I explained to you, this is the most interesting political event that is set to happen at the first half of this year, before we start to have a look at what may well end up happening in the second half of the year. In my view, if the Labor Party ends up winning this seat, there's a chance we could have an election sometime after August this year. But if the Liberal Party wins it, well, then it shows that they are starting to find a way to flip seats, including the seat of Dunley, which they had in their possession multiple times over multiple cycles. I remember in 2007, in 10 and in 13, this was a Liberal Party seat. Then in 16, 19 and 22, it flipped to Labor. The extreme majority of people in the seat are trying to pay off their homes. In fact, a higher than average, I should say, number of people in this seat are trying to pay off a home loan, which means the Albo dozen of interest rate rises that are all part of the cost of living and inflation picture. Well, people will be very alive to somebody who may well want to send a message or to punish Anthony Albanese. But something that was interesting today the Prime Minister was doing when it comes to cost of living was pretending that he was going to do something about people's power bills. I'll get to all of that in a moment. But again, inflation and cost of living is going to become a major political issue, and we will see what happens in the next little while, particularly going into that Dunley by-election. Has any bark actually come off the government, as opposed to the bark, not off the tree, but the bark that comes from the dog that's been making a lot of noise on this stuff? Now, yes, very early this year, inflation had fallen to the lowest level in 2 years, but before you start getting too excited, the current inflation rate is 4.3%. Remember, the Reserve Bank says that they will keep rising interest rates until it is somewhere between 2 and 3%. Also, while the average inflation rate is 4.3%, and again, I'm not going to pretend that's a bad thing, I want that number to be as low as possible. But here's the reality for people. While the headlines were saying greatest in 2 years, gas and household fuels were up by 12, almost 13%, followed by electricity, tobacco, bread and cereal, rent, food products, alcohol, dairy, new homes that were being purchased by the people who would live in them, non-alcoholic beverages and such and such. It goes on and on and on. All of that way higher than the 4.3% that, of course, they all get very excited about. As the government is desperately trying to put a gold star on itself for managing the economy, the headline might be okay, but as soon as you scratch the surface, the details are there about what is still too expensive for many people around the country. And by the way, how does Australia compare to the rest of the world? Again, let's just set the table for the conversation. This is the show that, yes, well, there's lots of opinion and lots of bluster. I always try to show you the data. I always try to bring you the receipts. I always try to show you the facts that come from places like the Bureau of Statistics or come from the OECD, which in this case has a look at the inflation rates for lots of countries around the world, and here we go. Australia's 4.3 is higher than the UK, it is higher than the US, it is higher than Canada, all countries that have either similar economies. Yes, New Zealand has a higher rate of inflation, but let's compare ourselves to the UK, the US and Canada, which is why the Prime Minister today was beginning the rollout process of saying that everything that he does has some angle on cost of living, no matter how small and how insignificant that is to the extreme majority of Australians. The Prime Minister was there with the New South Wales Premier today saying, look at us, we're doing something to put solar panels on public housing, therefore potentially cutting the power bills of people who live in what used to be called Housing Commission. Now,
Anthony Albanese has hinted cost of living help for households could be on its way, but did not give details.
And that's how the media, well, they ate it up. Now, people who live in Housing Commission, they deserve to have lower power bills like everyone else, but let's not pretend that the 30,000 people in New South Wales that will eventually, once you carry the one, cross your fingers, put 2 years together and blow in this direction, is anywhere near the millions of people that are suffering from the power bill increases that we just showed you that feed into the very inflation question that the Reserve Bank still says is too high and means interest rates will continue to rise. Which brings me to another bit of politics. We touched on this last night, but I wanted to bring it a little further into the show so you could see it with your own eyes as well, which is that while the Prime Minister is obsessed with blaming Coles and Woolies and Woolies and Coles and Coles and Woolies and Woolies and Coles and Coles and Woolies and Woolies and Coles, constantly, that is the problem with inflation, those evil buggers who were essential workers during a pandemic. Well, these are the people that are apparently now solely responsible for how much your bills are going up. Not, as we just showed you, what was it? 13% for gas, 10% for electricity, 10% for tobacco, which of course now is mostly taxed to the federal government. Well, as we know, there's great anger. And the Prime Minister is doing all he can to say it as much as possible that it is those damn supermarkets that are the problem. This is the exact same strategy that was used successfully to blame not the federal government but the Reserve Bank for the reason interest rates had to keep going up for the past 12 months or so.
My government is concerned about the price of what consumers pay at Coles and Woolies and other supermarkets.
Our government is focused on the prices that supermarkets charge.
If the supermarkets are buying it cheaper, they should be selling it cheaper too.